Welcome to A People's Guide to Publishing, the Vlogcast. I am your host, Joe Biel, the autistic publisher, and this is Elly Blue, the sane voice of reason. Still laughs at that one, 4 episodes in.
Today we're going to talk about fine art.
The coarse art.
Book cover design.
Mm-hmm.
So, Joe, you do much of the book cover design for Microcosm, not all of it, but do you want to start by kind of telling us what cover design is versus what it isn't? For instance, it's not necessarily the same as like cover illustration.
Right. So the number one misconception about cover design is that people tend to think of it like fine art or gallery art, where they think of like a beautiful painting and they, that like tells a story and contains these 45 points and like a lot of different plot details, and it has to have a dragon but also like a maiden and a rock and a key, and like that's not cover design. That is art, which is like they're not completely far apart, but they're not the same thing. So people often get confused who do graphic design. They can't easily translate that to book cover design because fundamentally what a book cover does that very few other things do is to communicate some very specific handles, like what it is, who it's for, how it's different, and maybe some other aspects of the niche. But it has to do that in 4 to 5 seconds, which, very few things do that, like even a logo, which is like a very complicated kind of design, doesn't have to communicate a lot of specificity. It's more like a vague generality.
Why does it have to communicate so much in so little time?
Because that is the amount of time that you have with your average person. That's the amount of time they will spend looking at it on a website, in a store. Like even when like an account buyer goes through a catalog, it's not like they're spending a minute on each page of the catalog. You're really getting 4 to 5 seconds, sometimes less.
So they need to be able to immediately tell right away some really basic things. And this is not like necessarily who the author is, unless the author is a famous person. But like, is it fiction or nonfiction? Is it gendered?
And they pretty much almost always are.
Yeah, they're mostly gendered. What will the book do for you, the reader? And it's like the title is a really important part of this, because if they're going to read it.
Yeah, what am I getting out of it is their big question.
So like choosing your title is almost more important part of the cover design than even designing the cover.
Right, like the title should be coherent and it should sort of lead you down a path of what you're getting out of this book. And then the subtitle should clarify that. And then your cover design should sort of fill you in on like other aspects of like, if it's a history of baseball, like who are the key players, what era, like what does it not include, is it East Coast or West Coast, things like that. Things that will really sort of help you to understand whether it's for you or not.
So one thing we're not probably going to be dwelling on very much here is literary fiction. Literary fiction is a pretty small niche that has an outsized reputation. And the rules of cover design, I guess, are the same for that, but I really don't feel like I have a very good understanding of what the conventions are. So I think we should skip talking about that and really focus on what we are best at nonfiction.
Well, I mean, and it's all kind of the same, really, and I think that's sort of where people get tripped up, is like literary fiction is really the same as nonfiction. Like, if it's like, say, a book about playing cards, the book should have cards on the cover. If it's like a book about, like a fantasy book about a forest, like you don't want to put a cave on the cover, I feel like I have to have this same conversation every single day, and the average cover goes through 20 revisions.
Wow. I mean, I think part of it is, like, no matter what genre your book is in, you want, like, one of the things you need to communicate on your cover is that, and you do that by making it conform, at least somewhat, with other books of the genre.
Yeah.
Like, when we published Unfuck Your Brain, Joe went to the bookstore and noticed that all of the best-selling self-help books were yellow, so we made that book yellow.
It's a little silly, but
it works.
It was her debut book. She was, don't take this personally, Faith, a then unknown, and she was, but it was like the book was fundamentally different because it was edgy. It had F-bombs like a motherfucker. It was like, it had a lot more personality than any comp that we could find, And so we needed it to be similar but dissimilar in the right proportions to really show people, like, this is a serious book that will help you, but it is not your grandpa's self-help book.
So, like, what would you say are the order of elements that a person should notice about a book cover?
So, and there's like so much hard science to this. So again, it's like genre, like, which is self-help or, fantasy or whatever. And then if the author is of any notoriety, that would be number 2. That's like pretty, even if it's just like their second book and their first book did pretty good. Pretty good meaning 5,000 plus.
Or if they were on reality television.
Right, yeah. If they're like a celebrity chef, if they had any reason, or even if they're like a constant speaker on a lecture circuit, or like they go to every nerd conference about linguistics. Like if somebody is an expert on fonts and they write a book on fonts, then all of their font nerds are going to go want to read that book. Like no book is for everybody. It's like you just need to tap into the right people. The third most important thing is the blurb. Like if you have a cover blurb, particularly of a famous person, an endorsement that makes the book credible for an otherwise non-credible author. And sometimes that's like the forward by, sometimes that's like Vanity Fair says this person knows fashion like nobody else. Like it's things like that your average person going to the bookstore is going to be like, I do need another book about fashion, but what has this person got to say that I don't already know?
It's like when you're in the drugstore and you're in the as seen on TV section, and they always say as seen on TV, and it totally works.
But that means nothing, because that just means they bought advertising. But this is kind of the same way, where like they just happen to once impress some magazine or existing famous person, or they have a friend, and that is enough where that like flips the skeptic to being like, oh, what's going on here? And that literally is like the number one scientific motivator that makes people turn the book over, read the back, and then continue to like read that top line blurb, which is number 4, and that's the thing, which is we call the tagline. I wrote one yesterday that was like, sing the songs of the revolution, which is like, you don't want it any longer than that, because you're really just trying, it's like your third opportunity at a subtitle, you get to sort of leverage a little bit more. And then like maybe they're going to read a couple more blurbs, maybe they're going to read the publisher's description, and then kind of at that point they more or less are going to buy the book if they spend that many seconds looking at it, because you've broken the 5-second barrier. And at that point maybe they're not going to buy it that day or that minute, but they're going to buy it. It's just a matter of when.
But most of us don't have the design skills that we need to even necessarily know how to choose a font, or know how to like source artwork, or know what works or what doesn't, or like what colors go together. Do you recommend that people without graphic design experience try to do their own? Do you recommend people hire a cover designer? Do you recommend people buy a ready-made cover design on the internet? What's the best way to proceed?
This is a very good question. So if you're writing Grandpa's memoirs, or a book that is just not for like an audience outside of people like maybe 3 people might erroneously purchase it, so you don't need to put effort or time into that unless like this is an important kind of vanity project for you that you want it to look good in 20 years when you like find it in the attic. Things like if you are trying to like break into sort of a conventional foray and you're writing genre fiction, you must have a conventionally attractive, professionally designed cover. Like there's just no way around it, because otherwise everybody's just going to assume that your book is as amateur as the cover is, But, and I don't know why this is, apparently somebody decided some time ago, for many nonfiction subjects, if your cover is god-awful ugly, nobody will care. Like, that will not be a deterrent to the credibility of your book. Is that fair? No. Is that terrible? Yes. It's terrible for me, on my eyeballs.
But Joe might not read your book. Well, if you want Joe to read your book, maybe
make it beautiful.
Have a beautiful cover.
For my eyeballs.
My other question is, if people are hiring a cover designer for their book, what is a reasonable amount to spend?
I am frequently amazed when I learn how much and how little people spend on cover design. I cannot tell you how many times I will meet a self-published author that spends $5,000 on a cover design, and I have to wonder why. Ellie has explained to me that it is not appropriate to explain to them that they should not be spending that kind of money because they've already spent that money and made that decision, and nothing I say will make them feel any better about it. But on the other end, I meet a lot of people that, it's like one thing, it's like, okay, I have a friend who's a designer, and I do, and that has gotten me out of many jams and many free gifts and generosities. And that's kind of a different thing because that's like somebody that believes in your work and is a professional expert who is doing that out of like the graciousness of like your relationship and believing in you. And that's totally fine. Like I don't feel like that is exploitation in any way. However, there is a weird thing on the internet where you can now pay $5 for a professional to do like what would be like a $250 to $500 cover design job. And that's weird. That's really weird.
That professional is probably living in a country where that $5 goes farther, but not necessarily that much farther.
Not far enough. Not far enough for their time. So I would say that, if you're doing this for real, depending what your genre is, I think like $100 to $500 is a reasonable amount to spend on a book cover design.
And if you're like really attached to the work of one specific artist and their work is in demand, they might quote you more like $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000. That's a choice you have to make, but also consider whether or not they are a professional book cover designer. Because you can pay a lot of money for a beautiful work of custom art that just doesn't work as a book cover. And like I would say, like get that beautiful art print to hang in your house, but then go and spend $250 employing a book designer and show them the art that you like, and they can come up with something that you will like, even if it's not necessarily by a famous name. And a famous name book cover isn't necessarily going to help your book sell either.
I know, and that's a really hard thing to explain to authors a lot, that just because they're friends with famous artist and famous artist is willing to cut them a deal, and instead of charging $50,000, they're going to do it for $5,000. Like, it's just not worth it, because as soon as the public is like, oh, this is not a book by famous artist, it's just a book with cover by famous artist, they're just like, they're done.
And the other thing is, the more famous and busy the person, the fewer revisions you'll get. Like, I would, every time in a million, I would want to pay less money for the person who's just starting out, maybe isn't as skilled, but is hungrier and is willing to like do as many revisions as it takes to get it right, rather than the person who's like, nope, this is it, you're done, and you're like, but that's not quite what we agreed on. And especially if you are new to directing this sort of work, if you are new to this, you won't necessarily know what to tell the cover designer, and this is like actually a really important part. What are the things that should go into a cover brief for the designer?
Sure. So you want to research your comp titles. So those are other titles that people would buy in addition to or instead of your book. And so you want to find 2 to 3 that are a good visual representation of what your book should look like. And then maybe like certain elements of them that are more important or good for continuity. And then you want to have a list of things that it should not be. For example, when we gave the brief to the designer for Unfuck Your Brain, we said yellow, simple, clear, actionable. Like we don't want to run the risk of people reading this as a humor book. We don't want them to, look at it and think uncredible. We want them to look at it and be like, okay, this is like edgy and maybe a little bit kitschy, but for the most part, it's like a serious professional book for the general public, rather than like a technical book for therapists, even though plenty of them enjoy it too. So it's like those are the things that you really want to push. And we did a book recently, What About Tomorrow, which is the history of punk rock in Russia. And so like we had like a consistent Russia propaganda poster design and color scheme. And, similarly, we did a book a couple years ago called Soviet Daughter, where, we sort of invoked a similar thing. And with that book, it was dangerous. Like, we really needed to make sure that it, like, looked like an adult graphic novel, rather than because the risk with comics, and especially like painted covers, is that they look like they're for children.
The other things that you really need to tell your designer up front, and I cannot stress this enough because you can go so wrong and lose so much money not doing this, is what dimensions your book are.
Yes, proportions.
Yeah, like, is it 5 by 7 inches or is it 7 by 5 inches? You always do it width by height. So, like, Unfuck Your Brain is what, 5.5 by 7?
5 by 7.
5 by 7. And always double check this information.
And that is hard. That half an inch is hard to correct in post.
Yeah, and I would always, like, one thing I always try to tell designers, especially if they're doing like an illustrated or painted cover, is like, we need an extra like half inch to really honestly even an inch of like space that's painted but doesn't contain important information on all 4 sides of the cover, so that we can like move it around to make sure like that, you know, our text doesn't have to go on top of the head in the painting or whatever.
And sometimes you want that to wrap around onto the spine. Sometimes you get a really killer cover blurb and then you have to adjust to put 2 lines of text on the top and not have it run into any other vital live area. You know, things like that. You just want that maneuverability, and a lot of times your designer is not gonna, you know, sometimes they'll really want to be the only one to make changes, but other times they're just done when they're done.
Yeah, and you don't want to, you also want to tell them what format it should be in. Like, if you're publishing only an ebook, they will probably go about their work differently than if you are publishing a print book. Or if you're publishing a book where you only have 2 colors of ink on the cover, that's going to be a different format and design than if you are publishing a book that's printed at full CMYK 4-color printing. Right. So you need to be upfront with that. I highly recommend, before you start working, make sure you are agreed on the price, on the deadline, and on the number of revisions, and like also like how the process will go. So when some designers, when we start working with them, like, there's some designers that we work with that we really trust, and that we're like, okay, we're going to give you this concept, and you're going to give us like 3 tiny little pencil sketches, thumbnail ideas, and we'll choose one, and then you'll just do it, and that's it. There's other designers that we work with that are like really fast, and they are like come up with 10 or 20 ideas, and then we choose like 3 for them to develop a little bit more, and then we're like, oh no, how about a different one? And then they'll do it, but not everyone will agree to work that way. So you need to have some good communication about that, because if somebody is like, I have committed, 10 hours to working on this project, and 5 hours in you're like, no, I want to start over with a different idea, you're going to have an awkward conversation.
And some people work really fast, and some people, like, if you paid them hourly, you would be paying them $20,000 for a cover, just because they're not efficient in dialing in their process. Like, for example, we have another new book where it's like black and gold metallic ink, and so we can't use any other colors besides white, like white being the absence of ink, because the only 2 inks are black and gold.
And sometimes, like, you just have to be ready to make that hard call. Like, we have definitely had it happen more than once, where we've commissioned a cover, and the cover is exactly what we want, and then we go back to our comps, and we put our cover next to the comps, and we're like, that doesn't hold up.
Right.
Like, that looks like amateur hour next to these. Nobody's going to choose this one on the shelf over that one. And we've paid the designer and thanked them and apologized to them, and then hired someone else to do it. And eaten that cost.
So one thing we do is like sociological books about bicycling. Most books about bicycling are shelved under sports, which is a dreadfully different shelf full of people doing diet, weight loss, and race training books, which bear no resemblance to the books that we do.
Back in the dark ages of 2012, which was when the publishing industry was tanking, Maker Cousin published a book with a very undeveloped cover and title. I can say this critically because I wasn't there for it. It was called Mark Twain Was Right. You might think that it was a collection of quaint sayings or some kind of work of literary criticism. It was in fact a graphic novel about the 2001 Cincinnati protests after a black teenager was shot by police at a traffic stop. Totally compelling, amazing story. Totally the wrong title. Nothing about that book told you what was in it. How many did we sell between 2012 and 2018?
Less than 1,000. I mean, about 800, I think.
So in 2018, Joe had the idea.
Credit where it's due. Being at Comics Pro with one of the owners of Secret Headquarters, and he picked up the book and he shook it at me and he was like, could you at least make a dust jacket for this thing so it has a decent cover? And then, and we were like, oh yeah, we could do that. And then we thought about it and we were like, we should just like make it a decent cover.
We changed the title to 6 Days in Cincinnati, which captures both the urgency and the actual events that happened, and then a subtitle that framed it in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, which had sprung up since the original publication and was a much better frame of reference than something Mark Twain said.
And it taps in perfectly to 6 Seconds in Dallas, which is like one of the key books about the assassination of President Kennedy, which I liked because it made it out that this like black teenager was like as important of a person to be murdered as the president.
And like an important piece of our history that I think it's so important
and
to
was
know
lost.
About.
Yeah, it was very much
there
unknown.
was like a textbook about it and our graphic novel with the bad cover, and that was it. We also had the author do a drawing to promote the book, and we were like, oh, this drawing put on the postcard for the book would be the perfect cover. So we ended up having art from the book on the cover. This was your innovation, credit where it's due. We brought all of the books down the street on a handcart to the local print shop, and they literally glued the new cover onto the outside of the old cover.
We had asked them to strip and rebind, which is like where they tear the old cover off and then they trim it and then glue the new one on, but they had decided that it would be more efficient to just glue the new cover onto the old cover and then trim the edge.
But fortunately, I mean, I feel like if I had bought that book at a store, I would be like stoked. I would be like, this is the coolest thing ever. What even happened here? Not all of our distributors felt that way, but fortunately we sold through them so fast that we were quickly able to do a proper print run with the ISBN and everything.
Yeah, so we had 2,200 left from that first printing, which we sold in 1 month.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas we had sold 800 in the previous 5-6 years.
And literally the only thing that changed was the cover and title.
Mm-hmm. And in some cases, even the old cover was still there.
I wish we had kept a copy. Do we have any copies of that?
We do, I think. I think we have a few, because every time they surface, somebody gets very excited.
Yeah, we've got to hang on to that and put it in the vault.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's the best cover parable that there is, and we'll include a link to that book also.
And that is why your cover does matter.
It really matters.
Because and I feel like that's the one where, because people are always like, oh, but if the book is great, like, we'll just put whatever cover on it. And you're like, no, put the right cover on it.
Think of the cover as like the key for the reader to unlock the greatness of your book.
To understand
actually
it.
know it exists.
For like it to get in front of enough eyeballs for them to be like telling their friends about it. In any event, this has been The People's Guide to Publishing, the Vlogcast. I am your host, Joe Biel, the autistic publisher.
I'm Elly Blue. I am not necessarily a voice of reason all the time.
And we'll see you next week where we will talk about something else.
What a preview! I'm excited for something else.